Wireless security used to be a little bit easier when everybody who was working in an organization was on premise when they were using the wireless network. However, today we have a lot of remote workers. And so we want to have something in place so that remote workers can work inside the network. And to do that, we use a VPN. Now, a virtual private network means that the user can be at home but can log on to the network as though they were on premise. So that's what VPNs do primarily. Now we do that through something we usually call a radius server. There are other types of servers, for example, TakeHex Plus, Zero OAuth or Open Authorization, and SAML. So there are many others as well, by the way. I can give 12 or 13 different ones. I don't want to muddy up the waters here. But you can also, through the configurations that you put on your Radius server, limit remote users to certain non-resource intensive. But you can also, through Radius, limit remote users to non-resource intensive apps. In other words, voice over IP, for example, or streaming. So you could limit those users so that they aren't using up a lot of the bandwidth that's being used to get back and forth between the workplace and the home computer. Guest networks also isolate guests from internal networks. Let's take a look at quarantining. Quarantining is a way that we deal primarily with bring your own devices. So when I, as an employee, come into work, if I'm going to be using my own device on the corporate network, I want the network to check to make sure my device isn't going to give viruses or malware to the network. And the way I do that is through this network access network access control. I can check BYOD devices from within the network when somebody tries to log on to see if a specific security policy is in place. In other words, it could say, well, you can't connect to my network until you get your updates for your For example, the network could say to my computer, you can't get on my network until you update your security patches or that you get a signature download for your antivirus, things like that. Now, once a device fails, we have a couple of ways that we could deal with that. Two different levels that we've put down here. The remediation network, which automatically diverts that user to a remediation server, or in some cases a whole remediation network that can get the device up to the requirements and then allow the user onto the network. The other method is something we call a walled garden. The idea of this is that you give some access to certain things, but you don't get full access. And one of the things that you might give access to is a web page with instructions that the user needs to go through to remediate their machine so that now it's up to snuff so that the server will allow them onto the network. One of the challenges that we run into are the legal compliance issues. So in a corporate network, we have several legal regulations that a company has to adhere to. Now, often it's not the adherence that is the problem, often it's not the adherence that is difficult, it's the proof of compliance that is the time-consuming task. But I just want to give you a sample of the complexity of these requirements. Now, this is one of those areas that the book doesn't even touch, and so this is an extra. But let's take a look at some of the requirements here. The HIPAA Act, in other words, medical documentation, says that documents related to HIPAA must be retained for 6 years from the date of creation or last modification. The General Data Protection Regulation does not call out a specific retention period, but it mandates that personal data should not be kept indefinitely. In other words, old data might be In other words, the greater the amount of data, the greater the risk of somebody getting into some of it. The California Consumer Privacy Act, similar to the GDPR, the CCPA, requires businesses to avoid retaining unnecessary data and to implement reasonable security measures. The GLBA or Graham-Leach-Bliley Act says that financial institutions must maintain records for 6 years. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act, one of the most common ones you hear about in the industry, says that you must keep financial records for 7 years for certain documents, while others, like customer invoices, should be kept for 5 years. The PCI DSS, or Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, this has to do with credit cards, says that audit logs must be retained for a minimum of 1 year, but credit card data should not be retained if not necessary for security. The Bank Secrecy Act. Most records must be maintained for 5 years that deal with bank transactions and customer account information. The General Business Records. Common practice suggests retaining various business documents, such as financial statements and tax records, for 7 years. However, it says some records may need to be kept permanently, such as contracts and legal documents. So you can see there are a lot of different legal compliance issues, and trying to keep track of them all and make sure you satisfy them all can be a big headache.